Hey guys, this is Ms. Ghazali with another video, and today we'll be covering modules and functions in Python. Now, you're already familiar with some built-in functions that Python has. For example, we've used the print function extensively, right? So this is a built-in function that allows you to print something to the screen. You can just use it and Python recognizes it because it's built in. We've also used the length function that returns how many characters are in a string. We've also used the input function, which allows us to get some input from the user. Okay, and of course there are many more functions that are built in and that are at our disposal. Now, besides the built-in functions, Python also has modules in a library called the standard library. And basically, each module contains a group of related functions that will make coding easier for us. So for example, some modules that are available to use in Python are the following. There is the math module, which you might find very useful, especially if you're doing a lot of math in your program. And this has mathematics related functions. There's the random module, which we'll be using today, and it has random, number related functions, okay, and so on. I'm not going to list all of them. This is something that you can easily find on Google if you search up modules in Python, and you'll be able to see what is available to you and how it could benefit your program or what you want to do. But the math and random are pretty popular because a lot of the times in programs we want to use math, we want to do a lot of calculations, we want to use fractions, we want to round, we want to cut off decimals, so math module is very useful. And then same thing with the random. Random helps us generate random integers and do a bunch of things related to randomness, which we'll find useful, especially when designing games and things like that. But because these modules are not technically built in, we have to actually import them. And so it's very easy. As long as you remember that you need to import the module, then you're able to use it. So that's all you have to do. And so to import a module, this is what you have to do. Number one, use the import keyword. Number two, use the name of the module. Number three, and number three, you can import more than one module by separating them with commas. Okay, so I'll show you an example. All right, so let's say we want to import the random module. What you would do is the following. You would just write from math import star. Sorry, not math, we're importing random. Okay, and so use the import, use the from, and import keywords. Forgot to write that. Okay, so from random import star. Now the star just means import everything. So what this is saying is you want to import the whole library, which means you're importing every single function that they wrote in that library. And so you always want to use the star because it'll just be easier. You don't have to remember what certain functions are called. So just import everything and then you could use everything that's in the random module. Okay? So that's it. I've just imported the random module, which means I can use it. So I can show you guys some ways to use the random module. So we can use the random module to generate a random number. So generating a random number. So one way to do that, and this is not the only way, there are different ways, but I'm going to show you the easiest way. Let's say I want to generate a random number. I can use randsInt, and that's a built-in function. Now inside this function, let's say I want to sorry. Let's say I want to generate a random integer between two values. So let's say 1 and 10. Okay, let me run that. So look at that, it generated a 10, which is technically between 1 and 10, including 10. If I run it again, I get a 1. If I run it again, I get a 6. So I can keep running this, and you'll see every time I run, it's a number that's between 1 and 10 inclusive. So it includes both the start and the end value. Okay, so that's pretty interesting, and I believe that if you put in one number, okay, so that's not allowed. We need two, I guess, two parameters. Okay, so if I want to generate a number between, you know, I don't know, 100 and 110, if I run that, it'll give me 107, run again, 105, run again, 110. All right, you get the idea. Okay, so very useful. We'll use that later. So I'm just going to comment that out. Now, actually, before I do that, if I didn't import my random and I tried to run this, look at what happens. We're going to get an error. It's not going to recognize the function, the built-in function randint, unless you import the library or the module random. Okay? All right, so that's just a little you know, quick summary about importing modules. Okay, I think we could separate by a, I guess not. I guess we're gonna have to import them separately. Okay, so with the math, I can do things like this. Pi would be built into the math module. Pi is a constant. Okay, so it's not a function, but it's a constant that they built into the math module, which is useful because maybe, you know, it's better than having to write the whole number or so many decimal places when you can just type in pi. Again, though, if I comment out the import statement and try to run this, it's not going to recognize what pi is. It's gonna probably think it's a variable, but you never even defined it, so it's going to give you an error. Okay, so that's for math, and obviously random and math, those modules have a lot of things that you can use. You're just gonna have to Google it whenever you need to use them, because it's all online. You know, there's no point in memorizing all of them. You could probably memorize a couple that you might use a lot, but overall, I would say if you ever want to know what's built into a certain module, just look it up online. All right. Now let's get into functions. So what is a function in Python? So a function is like a mini program within a program. Okay, functions, and you guys know this already. Functions help us, let's say they serve as shortcuts whenever you don't want to keep repeating lines of code. They're kind of similar to functions in math in that sometimes they take an input and give you some type of output, but you know, they're slightly different. So the whole idea of functions is that we're going to create a function and that'll serve like the blueprint of what it's going to do. And then in order for anything to actually happen, you have to actually call the function. So first, you must define a function and its purpose. And second, you must call the function. So if you just create the function and nothing else and try to run your program, nothing will happen because you've just created the blueprint of what you want your program to do. So in order for the program to do anything, you actually have to call the function. Okay, so let's try a very basic function. Okay, so write a function that prints hello there to the screen. Okay, so if you think about it, this function doesn't need any input because all it's doing is printing something to the screen, no matter what. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define our function, and in order to do that in Python, we have to write the word def, D-E-F, the keyword def. Okay, so this tells Python that you're about to define a function. Okay, so let's give it a name. So how about we call it a greeting function, okay, because that's what it's doing. Okay, and then you need parentheses. Now, nothing is going inside the parentheses because this is not taking any input. All it's doing is printing to the screen. Okay, so our function, we called it greeting. So that's a name I came up with. You could have called it anything else you wanted. Okay, but I would recommend, highly recommend, to use a name that describes the purpose of the function. Okay, so if it's a function that finds the area of a circle, then you should probably call it area of circle. You get the idea. Okay, so def just means you're defining a new function. This greeting in this scenario is the name of our function, and you always need the parentheses. Now, sometimes something is going to be inside the parentheses, but not in this particular function. Okay, then press enter and it will indent by itself. Okay, and don't forget the colon. All right, and we said that this function is just printing hello. So I'm just going to print hello. All right, and that's it. And I'm going to run it. Now, if you run this, you won't get an error, but you'll notice that nothing happened. So why isn't anything happening? So the reason for that, and I already kind of went over it, is because we only defined our function, we did the blueprint, but we never called it. Okay, so this is just a blueprint. It doesn't tell Python to run anything. It just tells Python, this is a function, it's called greeting, and that's it. This is what this function does. So, in order for anything to happen, I would actually have to call my function, and that's just by actually typing out the name of my function, which in this case is greeting. So now if I run this function, it'll say hello, because Python executed line 39. Okay, so this is just a very basic defining a function and then calling the function. Okay, so again, this is where we define the function, and then this is where we called the function. So 2 steps. Okay, let's do something a little bit more interesting. Let's say you want a similar function, except this one, you know, maybe you'll ask the user for their name, and then you'll greet the user by their name, right? So let's do this. Name equals input. What is your name? Okay. And then we can do something like this. Let's create a function called personal greeting. Okay. And let's have it take in a parameter, someone's name. Now, I'm not going to use the same variable name, although you could, and I'll explain that later. But just so that we don't get things confused, I'm going to call it n. Okay. So what this what this function will do, personal greeting, is it will take in someone's name and then it'll print out a personal greeting. So hello plus n. Okay? Now, nothing is going to happen other than, if I run this right now, nothing's going to happen other than the program will ask me what is my name. So let me try that. Mike, and nothing happens. And that's because we defined our function, but we didn't call it. So here's what we can do. So I'm going to move my function to the top just so you can kind of follow the logic here. Alright, so after the user tells us what their name is, we're going to do this. We're going to call our personal greeting function, and we're going to pass on to it the variable name. So here, this is just a placeholder. It's showing us what this function is going to do with whatever you pass on to it. So what this is saying is that it's going to take n, and then it's going to print hello, and then it's going to add on n to the end of that. But when we ask the user for their name, we save that information in a variable called name. And so if I want my program to print hello and that person's name, I have to pass on the parameter name instead of some random n, right? So again, this n, that's a local variable because this n is just accessible inside this function. So it's basically just a placeholder so that we know what the function is doing with any information you pass on to it. Okay, so if I run this now, what is your name? So Mike, it's going to say hello Mike. Okay, so what it does is when I typed in Mike, it saved it in my name variable. And so my name variable now contained the value Mike, and then I passed it into my personal greeting function. And so it took Mike and it added it in this spot right here in line 45 where n is, because that's what I told Python this function should do. So basically you're by defining your function, you're telling Python what you want it to do and whether you're expecting to pass on a value to it or not. So some functions will require some input, some functions won't. And it kind of depends what your function is supposed to do. So a lot of math functions require input. So for example, if you are trying to find the area of a circle, you need either the diameter or the radius, right? So you have to pass on the diameter or the radius. So it doesn't make sense to make that function not have an input. So speaking of that, let's create our own function. And actually, let's do a function that finds the area of a rectangle. Okay, so write a function that finds the area of a rectangle. Remember that area of a rectangle is equal to length times width. So clearly, to find the area of a rectangle, we need two pieces of information, not just one. We need the length and the width. So it makes sense that now we need to pass on two inputs, two values, two parameters. Okay, so I'm kind of using different words interchangeably so you understand what a parameter is. Okay, so let's define our function. So I'm going to call it area of rectangle. Okay, and like I said, we need two parameters, length, comma, width. Okay. Let me do this actually. I'm going to say L times L and W. All right, and then we're going to print the area of your rectangle is, all right, and we know that in order to find the area, we need to do L times W. Now, that's an issue because L times W are going to be integers or floats, and you are trying to print this out in a statement, so we need to typecast as a string. Okay, so that should be fine. So now let's ask the user for some input. So we could do this, length equals input. What is the length of your rectangle? Okay. Width equals input. What is the width of your rectangle? All right. Now, these are strings right now because we just used the input function. So let's typecast. Length equals, we could do it this way. We could have typecasted in one shot over here, but I like to do it separately. Width equals int width. Actually, instead of int, let's typecast as a float because it's possible that the length and width are decimals, so that's probably safer. All right, so then what we can do is we can call our area of rectangle. How come it's not coming up? Let's see. Let me print. No, actually, I'm not going to print because there we go. Area of rectangle, and then we're going to pass on the length, comma width into our function, and so our function is supposed to print a statement. So let's see. What is the length of your rectangle? I'm going to do 10 and 2. So the area of your rectangle is 20. So let me try two other numbers. So 25 and 2. The area of your rectangle is 50. All right, now this doesn't seem that useful because I'm only using the function once, but you could see how this would be useful in a program where you're supposed to find the area of many rectangles. Sorry, guys. So again, you'll find out how useful this is when we actually do things that become repetitive, and you're able to use functions to help you kind of streamline your code so it's cleaner and it's not as many lines of code, and it's easier to read and things like that. All right, commenting this out so we can try another example. Let me see. Okay. Okay, so let's create a program that, does this for a lot of rectangles. Okay, so because we want to ask the user the same questions over and over again, we can use a while loop. Okay, so let's do something like this. Number of rectangles equals input. How many rectangles do you have? So we'll let the user tell us. Okay, and I'm going to typecast as an integer because that's going to be a whole number. All right, so now we want a loop that will run as many times as there are rectangles. So let's do this. While count is strictly less than number of rectangles. Okay, so this is going to start a loop that's going to start count at 0 and then run until we have number of rectangles. So it's gonna run as many times as the number of rectangles we have. Okay, so let's do this. Length equals input. Enter the length of the rectangle. Okay, then let's do the same thing for width. Oops. Enter the width of the rectangle. Okay, Again, I want to typecast, so let me do it. Let me typecast as a float. All right, great. Let's get our function back. So I commented out, so I'm actually going to bring it back. Okay, and uncomment it. Okay, so we do have a function right here that takes the length and width and then prints out a statement. Okay, so let's do this. Let's call our function, which is called area of rectangle, and let's call it on length, comma width. Okay, now keep in mind this is a loop, so we have to make sure we increment our counter. Otherwise, we'll end up with an infinite loop. All right, so I'm gonna run this. Let's see what happens. Okay, I have 3 rectangles. Enter the length of the rectangle. So 6 and 2, so 12. Enter the length of the rectangle. So it did the math for my first rectangle, which was length 6, width 2. So it did 6 times 2, it gave me 12. Okay, let's see. 10 and 3, it gave me 30. And then, I don't know, 20 and 2, it gave me 40. So you could see it was 3 times. Now this looks horrible. Okay, so we're gonna start actually thinking about output and how to make things look cleaner and just overall more visually appealing and easier to read. So let's say I want to do this. Let's say that I want to be specific about which rectangle I'm talking about. So instead of enter the length of the rectangle, I'm going to say enter the length of rectangle number. Now, this is going to be interesting. I'm going to do the same thing for width. The width of rectangle number. Okay, so now count is starting at 0. So I wouldn't want it to say enter the length of rectangle 0. I would want it to be 1 ahead each time because it's starting at 0 and stopping right before the total number of rectangles. So it's always going to be 1 behind because of the way we're indexing. So I'm just going to do, if I don't want 0 the first time, I want 1, I'm just going to add 1, right? Oops, that has to be outside. And I'm going to do plus count plus 1. Okay. Plus count plus 1. Now, that's going to give us an error because I need to typecast this as a string. So no big deal. Do what you got to do so that this print statement is okay. All right. So that gives us the 2 sentences, and it specifies the rectangle number. I also would like to add some spaces. So maybe I can add a space here. So I can just print just a blank. Okay. Let's try that. See what happens there. How many rectangles do you have? 3. So look at this. Enter the length of rectangle 1. Wait, the colon is in the wrong spot. So let's do that. And then we're going to have to add a colon. So add it over here and add it over here. Let me zoom out so you guys can see the whole thing. Okay, there it is. Okay, that should be okay. I'm going to add a space in here too. Run it again. Okay, how many rectangles do you have? Let's say 3. Okay, look at that. Enter the length of rectangle 1. So let's do 10 and 2. So the area of your rectangle is 20. Okay, enter the length of rectangle 2. So let's say 6 and 3. 18. Okay, enter the length of your rectangle. So 40 and 3. 120. Perfect. Okay. Now, I would probably want to go with units and put the units in there and all that just to make this a complete program and be as thorough as I can. But for the purposes of what we're doing, we don't have to do that right now. All right, so that kind of shows you how much power you have when you start combining loops with functions, you can have it repeat as many times as you want and call the function. And so it's pretty useful, and I think it creates a much more powerful program, and you could do so much more when you combine both things together. Okay, all right, let's comment this out and keep moving. All right, let's see. So I think this is a pretty good overview of how to define and use functions. So I think I'll stop here for today, and what I'm going to do is actually create a part 2 where I'm going to go deeper into functions and what they can do, and we'll also discuss returning values and using the return statement in functions, which will give us more powerful functions and will help us do a lot more things with our programs. But I'll stop here for today, and then just look out for part 2 coming up soon.